It's Monday, the 21st of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Rachel Maclean, Labour MP Carolyn Harris, Fellow of the centrist American think tank, the Brookings Institution, Richard Reeves, and Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley.
I think we've made it clear as a team and the staff and an organisation that we want to wear the armband.
But now England footballers are told not to wear One Love armbands after FIFA threatens to hand out yellow cards. This challenge from the boss of Britain's biggest business group.
If we settle for no growth in the next few years, we'll never fund public services that we need to fund.
But the Prime Minister says this to those who want a closer relationship with the EU.
I voted for Brexit. I believe in Brexit. The United Kingdom will not pursue any relationship with Europe that relies on alignment with EU laws.
I do believe the message did get over that boys need role models, and positive role models at that.
Why boys are falling behind at school and turning into unhappy men.
Clear follow-through on the phase-down of coal, not in this text. A clear commitment to phase out all fossil fuels, not in this text.
But the climate conference deal will ask us for loss and damage payments or reparations to be paid to developing countries. Let's start with the World Cup. It's underway and ongoing. England and Wales have their first matches today. Now, unless you've been hiding under a stone, you will have noticed the wealth of criticism of the hosts Qatar and the country's human rights record, including for its treatment of women, LGBT+ people and migrant workers. Now, this is the headline today, just in the last hour, BBC Sport, World Cup 2022. England, Wales and other European nations will not wear One Love armbands. You heard Harry Kane there in the headline saying that they wanted to, but now FIFA has said and issued a threat that they will get an instant yellow card for doing so. My question to everybody is this the right decision? Starting with you, Rachel.
Well, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, this is a matter for the sports governing bodies and for the England football team. And I think I want to start by saying, look, we all want to get behind them. We all wish them all the best of luck. It's a very exciting time, and I'm sure we'll all be willing them on. They are a fantastic team, and
sure. But is FIFA right to issue the threat that players, captains of the teams, could be issued with yellow cards if they wear these One Love armbands?
Well, I mean, personally, I'm a bit confused about the whole situation because I understood that the England football team were going to go ahead with wearing the armbands and accept the threat of having a yellow card.
It was a threat of a fine, I think, at that point, but it's now the yellow cards that have focused minds.
So, as I said, this is a matter for them. I mean, I think they've been very courageous in saying they are going to take a stand about this, and I think that's the right thing to do. And, of course, I would support them in doing that.
Carolyn?
Well, I'm supporting Wales as well as England because they both deserve our chibi cheering. And I'm not surprised that the FIFA have done this, but I am disappointed they've done it because this was the thing that both teams have had a platform since they've decided they were going there, or since they qualified to go, that have said that they were really aware of the issues with LGBT rights and that they would be doing something to make a stand. So I'm disappointed that they're not, but I do understand that to go into a game with that kind of disadvantage was never going to be a good thing. So I blame FIFA entirely for their attitude on this.
And Richard, where are you on this issue?
Well, I'm half Welsh too, so I'm supporting Wales. They had to draw the line somewhere, I fear. So the number of armbands that could have been worn, etc. And so they're in a difficult position. And I think we're so focused on the players and the commentators. I think the biggest signals are going to be just in the playing of the game and in particular in the refereeing of the game. It's the first championship where there are 3 female referees. We've just learned that they can actually be in any game. So you could easily get 2 conservative countries with a female referee. so it'll obviously be televised. And I think that actually, in some ways, that's a more powerful signal, which is business as usual, but including women, as opposed to the armbands and so on.
Well, I mean, Tim, for you, this decision, of course, comment on it, but more broadly, is it time that football was starting to make the headlines, the game itself? And is there a plus to playing it in Qatar?
As someone who, broadly speaking, loathes football, I'm more interested in the politics and the sport.
Yeah, true.
And many of these things could have happened and I never would have known because I never would have watched the whole thing. But I think FIFA made the right decision and I think England were right to abide by it. It is better to have a blanket ban on politics than to be partial and allow some politics and not others, because you're going to have a contest over what is the right politics to display. There's a similar rule that governs Parliament, by the way, that you're not supposed to go into, MPs are not supposed to go into the House of Commons and wear something that promotes a particular campaign. We in England, because gay rights are now so sort of embedded into our national DNA, take it as assumed that the rainbow flag, and this is a form of rainbow flag, is entirely uncontroversial. It's not. It's controversial within gay activism because there are disputes over what colours should be in it. It's controversial with religious conservatives. It is a political statement. And therefore, if you're not going to allow other political statements, you can't allow that one. My view is that if England feels this strongly about the human rights record of Qatar, it should never have sent a team in the first place.
But what about Carolyn's point about it being a platform, a big platform potentially, to actually raise issues in a country like Qatar?
Fair enough, and the individual players, if they wish to take that risk to their own careers, are entirely welcome to do that. That's happened in the history of sport. One thinks of the famous Olympics, of which two sportsmen gave the Black Panthers salute and got in a great deal of trouble for that. So it's up to the individual to decide to do that. But in terms of the rules, other players, other teams could wear right-wing symbols that we wouldn't approve of and we wouldn't like. Better to have a blanket ban than to have partiality.
Wales, as you said, are also playing their first game at 7 o'clock this evening. I think we should show some pictures of the team training. It's the first time Wales has been in the World Cup since 1958. That's just 64 years of waiting for those who can calculate it. Now, last week, the Prince of Wales gave the England team a special send-off, presenting them their tournament squad number, and it prompted this response from Welsh actor Michael Sheen. If we can just show you the tweet. He can, he says, of course, support whomever he likes, and as president of the FA, his role makes visit understandable, but surely he sees holding the title Prince of Wales at the same time is entirely inappropriate. Not a shred of embarrassment or sensitivity to the problem here. Carolyn?
Do you know, this pains me to say, because Michael Sheen is actually a friend, but I completely disagree with him on this.
Why?
Because he is the Prince of Wales. It's a title that he's entitled to hold. I'm absolutely delighted he holds the title, and I know he was in Wales just last week. He's in a very difficult position because he is English-born, but with that title. And he will, I assume, be supporting both sides, and whoever is in the longest will continue to support that side. The only time he will have a problem is when Wales are playing England in the final. And then I'm happy to share my
just
words
think
of
of
wisdom.
Wales-England final.
I mean, I am...
What odds? What odds do you think?
But I will be... Well, I wouldn't want to put odds in it, but I will be supporting Wales at that point, I will quite say. And I'll advise the Prince of Wales...
In case Michael Sheen's not watching the programme, have you told him he's wrong? Have you told him he's wrong on this?
I didn't tell him he was wrong. I did question his saying it in the first place. But, you know, he's in Australia at the moment. Lovely man. But we disagree on this.
Who are you supporting in the Wales-USA match? Because you've got dual citizenship.
Yeah, I'm US too. So, but I have to say it would have to be Wales at this point, just because that's where I've spent more time in the UK, and I have a Welsh mother. I have an American wife and a Welsh mother. So draw what conclusions you want from that. But.
Welsh mother.
And if you want to hear more about the issues, some of which we've been discussing today on the programme in Qatar on the World Cup, then listen to the brilliant Newscast podcast on BBC Sounds with Chris Mason and Adam Fleming. The latest episode asks, what can England and Wales fans expect in Qatar? Let me show you these headlines, starting with the Daily Mail. After shock claims UK could seek closer EU ties, Tories warn, don't betray us on Brexit. This was the Daily Express. Fury at absurd idea to go soft on Brexit. Now, the backlash in these papers follows a story and headline in the Sunday Times yesterday that said Britain mulls Swiss-style ties with Brussels, a suggestion suggestion there that there had been discussions within government about pursuing a Swiss-style deal with the EU. Switzerland has a series of bilateral agreements with the EU and is also part of the single market, and that also has freedom of movement. Downing Street labelled the claims as categorically untrue, but didn't deny a senior figure had discussed it with the Sunday Times. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth. She is in Birmingham. Hello to you, Alex, where Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has been speaking this morning at the Confederation of British Industry conference. Rishi Sunak spoke at that conference this morning. We were watching him. Alex, did he mention a closer relationship with Europe in his speech?
Well, he did mention a relationship with Europe, and perhaps that's no surprise because that has been one of the topics of conversation here, Jo, in light, of course, of that Sunday Times article that you mentioned that suggested they were mulling over the government some sort of Swiss-style arrangement, which effectively boils down to much closer ties with the European Union. As you say, categorically denied by Downing Street, but as you might expect, this did come up after the Prime Minister gave his speech today, and he was asked about it, not specifically about some sort of Swiss-style arrangement, but what his view was on what Britain's trading relationship should be with Europe post-Brexit, given the current economic landscape. And I don't think he could have been much clearer. The Prime Minister said, under my leadership, the UK will not pursue any relationship that relies on alignment with EU laws. So pretty clear there, and obviously that mirrors what we'd heard from Downing Street, that these claims about some Swiss-style arrangement aren't true. I think it's fair to say, Jo, that that's a message to those in his party, those Brexiteers who were concerned about these reports, as much as it is to the people in the room, because here there are some real questions about what Britain's trading relationship with the EU looks like right now. In fact, the boss of the CBI, Tony Danker, is saying that the UK really did need to resolve the existing Brexit deal, in particular those issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol, because I think the perspective is here that that is one of the things that's currently hampering growth. So it came up in that context. The message from the Prime Minister, though, pretty clear.
Right, on the issue of growth, because obviously that has been a hot topic for a decade or so, as many people would say. Tony Danker, you mentioned him, the head of the CBI. What else is he calling for in order to boost growth? And did Rishi Sunak talk about any ideas or policies?
Yeah, well, growth is the absolute focus of this conference, because given where we are economically, with the UK facing a recession, with inflation going up, with interest rates going up, and with the pressure on the public finances that the Chancellor set out last week, the question here that's being asked is how can businesses grow in that environment? And what Tony Danker, CBI Director General, said was he thought there were some things that government should and could be doing. He talked about reforming the planning system. He talked about the regulatory environment that businesses are subjected to. But the one that really caught attention was when he said that it should be more immigration, effectively relaxing the immigration rules to allow overseas workers to plug some of the shortages in the sectors that are facing real problems with the labour market at the moment. So that was his suggestion, and Rishi Sunak was asked about this, and he didn't engage directly with this idea about loosening immigration arrangements to allow more workers in to plug skills gap and labour gaps. What he instead said that he wanted a visa system that would attract the best and the brightest, and he then went on to talk about the need to tackle what he calls illegal immigration. So he didn't directly address the question, but the message from the CBI has been really clear that the government needs to look at trading relationships and its policy on migration from their perspective. They think they are things that would help businesses grow in this difficult economic environment.
Alex Forsyth, thank you very much. There at the CBI conference. Let me just show you the headline here in the Daily Mail. Jeremy Hunt budget could put UK in doom loop. This takes in all sorts of measures that were announced, and there were an awful lot of them by the Chancellor last Thursday, but particularly on higher taxes, the highest tax burden since the Second World War. Rachel, you supported Liz Truss in the leadership contest, who said that you can't tax your way to growth. Clearly, that's not what Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak think. Who's right?
Well, I don't think it's a question of who's right. With the situation we are facing now is a very serious situation, and the Chancellor and the Prime Minister were right to come forward with the budget that they came forward with.
With that level of tax rises.
We absolutely do need to focus on the end goal, which is driving growth, and that's where I would agree with the CBI. That is the only way we're going to get through this very challenging economic times that we face. Businesses need that stability. What the Chancellor did in the budget was set out how he's going to tackle inflation and set out a path towards growth, which will eventually, I very much hope, see us able to cut taxes at some future time. And I think, look, these are balanced and difficult decisions that the Chancellor had to make. And I think everybody would like to see lower taxes, and everybody believes in our party that that is the way to drive growth. Right. But clearly, we face a challenging set of circumstances at the moment.
Do you agree? Does that reassure you in terms of the government's plan for growth?
No, not at all. The problem is that if you just try to focus on immigration, if you try to focus exclusively on inflation and on making the books balance, you really have no plan for growth. And there's actually a risk that you end up piling taxes so high that you create a recessionary doom loop, as it's described. Look, here is the basic problem. When we left the EU, we had a choice. We could either sign up to a Norway or a Swiss-style or a Theresa May-style relationship, where we basically try to pay for access to the single market and keep trade barriers as low as possible. Failing to do that meant we were suddenly surrounded by trade barriers, which makes it very difficult for our economy to grow in relation to Europe. The only alternative then was what Liz Truss hinted she was going to do, which is a Singapore-style deregulationary, tax-cutting, pro-growth agenda where you make up for the lost trade with Europe by going gangbusters on trading with the rest of the world. Well, the mini-budget went belly up. The Tory party has panicked and has said, right, we are now all about balancing the books. In which case, if you take tax, if you take massive deregulation, if you take real free trade deals like with America off the table, the CBI is saying, what are we left with? We're left behind a trade barrier. So the CBI is saying, could you now please lower that trade barrier with the Swiss-style deal, and could you please plug our gaps in skilled labour, which the government's not done much to do to fill, by allowing more migrants into the country. That's the problem post-Brexit. We have yet to make a decision about how to make the economy grow once we're behind a tariff war.
Richard?
It was a horribly difficult statement to make. We're an energy importing country, inflation, growth going backwards. And so in the circumstances, and I will say that I think they had an even more difficult hand to play because of the mini-budget. Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary in the US, said after the mini-budget, the UK seems determined to become an emerging economy. And so they had to signal to the markets that the grown-ups were back in charge. Yes. They had to restore credibility. And unfortunately, that meant that they didn't have any room for a pro-growth budget because of the situation they were in. Maybe that will come later, but at this point, they simply had to say, you know, there's someone of the hand on the tiller again.
Right. Would you agree that there was nothing really for pro-growth for the reasons that Richard has just set out? That actually it was dealing with, first of all, inflation, a reaction to the mini-budget and getting the markets to trust the UK again?
No, I don't agree with that.
There was
actually quite a significant statement on growth in the budget.
Where?
So if you listen to the Chancellor, he talked about it would have been very easy for him to cut capital investment. That is the thing that is going to drive growth over the long term. He didn't do that. He kept in place a number of quite significant capital investment incentives.
Public sector national investment is going down.
He kept those in place, and he also kept a lot of the long-term infrastructure transport projects in place. Look, we would all like to see lower taxes. I'm a Conservative. You know, that's what I want. That's what all of us want. It's a balancing act. This is not easy. You know, and we actually do need to see some hope in this whole policy platform that people can vote for. And I think we did see some of that. But, of course, I will be always pressing for more on that regard.
There was R&D. There was a lot of talk at the CBI about things like robotics and attracting the top 100
and
experts
there was a whole statement on innovation.
But how do you explain to a business conference how, since leaving the EU, we have gone from cutting corporation tax to raising it to 25%, which is above the EU average? How on earth has a Conservative government taken us out of the EU and then affected to create a European-style social democratic high-tax economy?
And you agree with most of this in terms
I would
of
just
Brexit?
like to come back on that word hope. People in Swansea East and people on low wages in this country have got no hope with this Conservative government. They are worried about putting food on their table.
We did put the minimum wage up.
They are worried about paying their fuel bills. They are worried about whether they can afford toys and food for Christmas. So if we talk in hope, Rachel, let's give the people of this country the hope. But they haven't got it at the moment.
And we did put the minimum wage up in the budget, which I think is a very important step.
And to be fair, the bottom fifth of the income distribution actually gets slightly better.
It was more progressive, certainly, than the Liz Truss
reversal of the Truss approach.
But they were in such a mess to start with. This huge hole that Liz Truss had created. In comes Jeremy Hunt, meant to be a knight on a white charger, given an impossible task as trying to rebalance the books. It's never going to happen. They have really messed up this country.
Right. Do you think, though, that putting the tax rises proportionately on those who have the broadest shoulders was the right thing to do?
They could have done something on non-doms. They could have done something on the energy companies. There's so many people who have got spare to give. The people who are going to be fronting this, the people who are under the heaviest burden, are the people who are currently really struggling, really worried, really frightened. And what we're doing is making them more concerned. It's a terrifying situation, which it breaks my heart.
Rachel?
So I think what the Chancellor did was he was very clear that he did actually raise taxes on people with higher incomes, and that was a theme that came all the way through. And if you look at any of the objective analysis, and I think you've just said it, Richard, the burden does fall on those higher wage earners, and there was a significant amount of support that's gone to those vulnerable people. I mean, I'm a constituency MP. I meet people all the time who come to me with very difficult situations, and there is a lot of support that's gone to those local authorities to help those people. We've got the energy price cap, we've got the help for bills, we've got all sorts of help. That's the right thing to do. But, you know, there's no getting away from the fact this is a difficult time. This is a crisis made in Russia by Putin and by those energy bills and by those global factors and the onslaught of COVID.
And the mini-budget, as Richard has mentioned.
No,
Can I come to...
No, I just want to push back on that, if you'll allow me, because most of the analysis has said that actually, if you look at the gilt markets, and the Bank of England has said this as well, this is not to do with the mini-budget. That was a very...
It didn't say it wasn't to do with it. It said it was perhaps a smaller part than people initially thought.
Exactly.
It made it even more important to restore credibility,
effect.
didn't it?
All right.
All the measures were reversed immediately.
Russia.
They've all been reversed, and we're now in a very different situation. So the impact on the economy cannot be traced back to the mini-budget in quite the way
entirely.
that some people are suggesting.
Tim, I mean, listen, let's come back to your point about the options ahead. Whether or not people in government, I know it's been denied and rejected by Number 10, should they be looking at a closer relationship between the UK and the EU at this Swiss-style system, at some sort of access to the single market or not?
But I would personally say if they're not going to follow a Truss-style revolution in regulation and tax, then it's inevitable that they will look at that. Now, the core objections from the pro-Brexit wing of the Tory party are first anything which puts us under the jurisdiction of European courts, and the second is anything which forces us to align with regulations such that we can't do effective trade deals with other people in the rest of the world. And of course, and the third is any kind of agreement which is going to leave the borders open. But the immigration, to take it back to that, is a classic central example of how the Tories have got Brexit wrong, such that during his speech at the CBI, when asked what are the benefits of Brexit, Rishi Sunak said, immigration, we've got control of our borders. Well, we haven't. Because we have a massive illegal immigration problem, but also where we do have control over our borders, yes, European migration has fallen, but the government has plugged the gap with a massive increase in global migration, such that we now have, we're back to historic levels of migration. So the problem is not because of Brexit itself, because I'm pro-Brexit, but because of specific policy choices taken by successive Tory governments, we are not actually getting any of the material benefits of Brexit that we were promised.
Rachel?
So what I would like to see from Brexit is us not having a closer regulatory alignment with the EU. I think that's a mistake. We voted to diverge from the European Union on all of those matters, but we need to take advantage of that. And actually, the Chancellor did talk about that in the budget. He talked about the focus on innovation and some of the changes that we can make to enable our own, where we are very strong in this country, to take advantage of that. And we do need to have that agility to drive that growth and innovation. And that, you know, I think Tim has highlighted some. He's made some fair points about immigration. We have got a problem with illegal immigration. We do need to tackle that. And
do we need higher levels of net migration? I mean, can we achieve economic growth without higher net migration?
Yes, we can. My view is that what we need to do is we need to focus on the people in our own country, help them get back to work where they can and want to. Support is going to help them do that. But, you know, let's not forget that since we've left the European Union, we have bespoke routes for people to come to this country to work, for example, in health and social care, where, of course, we need more workers. And I think that's what the British people want. They want us to bring the brightest and best, but they want us to bring those people who are not then asking the taxpayer to subsidise housing and healthcare and education. And I think that's actually what people voted for, and that's what we're delivering.
When it comes to forecast, the Office for Budget Responsibility is forecasting in the region of 225,000 in terms of net migration next year. Is that too high or too low?
It's not a question that I can answer, because it's what does the British economy need?
Well,
and once
but Suella Braverman has said her long-term ambition, that's the Home Secretary, was to reduce net migration to below 100,000.
Yes,
and yet you have business leaders like Tony Danker saying we need to fill shortages in the labour market with higher levels of migration.
So I do think we want lower migration over a longer period of time, because what we want is those British workers, people in our country, to be skilled. We want them to have support to get into the job market, to fill the roles that we have those vacancies in. And, business will always ask for more migration.
Well, let's hear what Carolyn thinks in terms of levels of migration. It's about 240,000 net migration this year. It's pretty high just by the standards of the UK. 225,000 they're forecasting for next year. Should we have higher levels in order to fill shortages in various parts of the economy?
Well, we've got a huge problem with hotels and hospitality. Some are not even able to open, or guests are having to change hotels halfway through.
Yeah, so it's too low at the moment.
It's too low.
Right. What do you think, Richard? I mean, this is the issue that Tim is highlighting. Is that what is going to happen? Not a closer relationship, says Rachel, with the EU. Certainly not from a legal or regulatory point of view. But are we going to have high levels of immigration?
I think it's inevitable if we want growth. I mean, for understandable reasons, this was a no-growth autumn statement. So they're looking for how do we grow? And it turns out immigration, trade, reform of planning, etc., that's where you're going to get some of it from. There's an irony that post-Brexit, what we're hearing is, because of what's happened to the economy, to get more growth, we are going to need more planned immigration. We are going to need a clearer trade strategy, whatever that is, if we're going to grow as an economy. And I do think that these arbitrary numbers, like that 100,000, which I do believe was inherited from the campaign for 2010, is a made-up number. And instead, what we should be saying is, what kind of immigration do we need? How much immigration do we need? Rather than making numbers up that you can then to be held to account for. What we want is a pro-growth immigration policy and a pro-growth trade policy, because there isn't enough money to have a pro-growth budget. And I understand why that is. I honestly think that the government has played a very bad hand, about as well as it could have done in this autumn statement. It's a terrible hand. And so they're now looking for low-cost or free ways to grow the economy. Turns out, immigration and trade are top of the list.
Let's stick with you and your book, Richard, of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Man is Struggling. Why did you write this book?
I felt that the particular problems that men, and particularly working class men and boys, were having in the education system, in the labour market, weren't getting enough attention from mainstream institutions and the media, including the one I work for in DC now, the Brookings Institution. And that's partly because there was this fear that somehow it meant you were going to care less about the ongoing problems of women and girls. That's not true. We can think two thoughts at once. And I genuinely believe that if you leave these real problems unaddressed, they fester and they can fuel all kinds of difficult politics. They can fuel all kinds of difficulties in our society. We can't neglect the problems of boys and men and hope that we'll all flourish, including women and girls.
Tim?
I agree entirely. I think men have faced two problems. One is technological and economic, which is that changes in the economy have not helped them. So in particular, the moving of blue-collar jobs overseas, jobs that men traditionally flourished in. The second problem is a cultural one, which is the feminization of Western culture. I'm not saying that's a conspiracy. I'm just saying, from a male point of view, I think it is something I experience and feel. That it feels as though the culture increasingly does not have strong, positive role models of male authority. And I think underpinning all of that is the rise of single-parent families, which again is not to judge anyone. It is simply the case, I mean, I know this from my own family because my father was raised in a single parent, that when things like male identity, male pride, male virtues are inherited. They're transmitted from father to son. And when you have such a large scale of that transmission being broken, where boys do not have that direct relationship with a male authority figure, I think that makes it harder for them to grow up with a positive sense of what it means to be male. So all of these things come together to make it just a little bit more difficult for someone to have a clear sense of what the male virtues are. And I agree entirely with Richard, that does not mean, to identify that and acknowledge that, does not make one anti-feminist in any way. These things have got nothing to do with the advance of women's rights. I'm just saying there have been cultural and economic changes which I think have disadvantaged men and left them feeling sort of alienated and stranded.
Carolyn?
Do you know, I think a large part of the problem, especially for working class men and young boys, is that it's what Tim says, it's the role model. Big boys don't cry. you need to be the hunter-gatherer, you need to be the one who's the provider, and women are not like that anymore. Women don't need don't need a man in their life to actually progress and go on. And I'm a mother of sons, and I see this every day, you know, where my son says to me, "What's for tea, ma'am?" He wouldn't dream of saying to my husband, "What's for tea?" He'd starve if he asked my husband what's for tea. but, you know, until my son is of an age where he knows it's his responsibility. And I think that's the problem. I think working class people, we are our own worst enemies, and we allow these stereotypes to go rolling over.
Do you think there's any threat to the issues that women face by taking on the mantle that Richard has set out?
No, I don't.
You don't?
No, I don't. And I think it was Richard that said, we can think 2 thoughts at once. Actually, I can think way more than 2.
You're very impressive, Rachel.
No, come on, Jo, so are you. And look, I'm a mother of sons as well, and I'm more likely to say to my sons what's for tea than they are to say it to me. And, you know, I think everything that you said is absolutely right, Richard and Carolyn. And of course, we have to treat people as individuals. This is not about you're a woman, you're a man, so therefore you are this or you're that. It's about what does that individual person need. And I think your book has, I'm sure I haven't read it, but I've looked at the sort of blurb of it, and I think that's where you're going with that. And how do we get the public policy response? And we should never try to say we champion this group of people, so therefore that means that other group are forgotten. We have to champion all of them and get the right support for them.
Is it about individuals in this sense? I mean, Tim's shaking his head.
Well, I think to the extent that if you see there's a group that have particular problems, say, like we're struggling to get enough women in Parliament, for example, then you'd look at, well, what's the barrier there? But if you're also looking at a situation where among British men under the age of 45, the biggest cause of death is suicide.
Yeah.
And it's 3 or 4 times higher among men than it is among women. And so perfectly appropriate to just say, what's our health policy doing to address this mental health crisis among our young men? Or if working class boys are the ones who are doing worst across the board in education, so our school system is failing our working class boys, perfectly appropriate to say, what is it about the challenges facing boys in that situation? And what's the challenge over here, say, with social media and girls or the pay gap or whatever over here? So when there are these big group differences, it's appropriate to look at groups whilst respecting the individual.
Well, let's take education, for example, because there have been complaints and criticisms that the state education system has become overly feminised. I think you used the word earlier, Tim, and that hasn't worked as well as it might for groups of boys. Does that need to change?
I think so. I mean, on the point about individuals versus groups,
yes,
there are certain biological realities. Yes, it's all about the individual, and masculinity is a construct to some extent, and some individuals will feel it stronger or exhibit it in different ways. But there are biological realities about the way in which men and women grow up and experience life. They feel differently at different times in their life. And I fear that our culture doesn't necessarily keep track with that or reflect that reality. And one problem is that we've developed a very therapeutic style of dealing with our problems. I mean, a classic thing is to say to people, tell me how you feel. And the problem is that many men don't want to talk, or they don't want to talk that way. Men have a different way of communicating, but the whole way in which our culture has shifted towards trying to deal with an individual's problems actually, I think, works against the biological realities of masculinity, which is that we don't want to have those conversations. And to make things even worse, it now feels sometimes like if a man says how he really does feel, he might be cancelled because he might feel something that's really politically incorrect.
The balance to strike here is between recognising that there are, on average, these differences, some of which are rooted in biology, and using them to determine people's roles in life. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people are concerned about accepting these biological differences is that historically they have been used to say, well, yeah, women can't do this, women can't be engineers, their brains don't work that way, or women can't be prime ministers, what if it's the wrong time of the month, or whatever it is.
Men can't be nurses.
Men can't be nurses because they're not nurses. As Florence Nightingale famously said, men can't be nurses because they're not nurturing enough. And so I think recognising these differences in the education system is worthwhile because we have fewer and fewer male teachers in our schools. We have shifted away from vocational forms of learning and more applied forms of learning, which on average tends to disfavour boys. It's okay to say that. I wouldn't say that we've feminised the education system. I'd say we've equalised it, and maybe in some cases we need to redress some of that balance back towards some of the ways that are more boy-friendly without losing
But would that
progress.
disadvantage women then, in that sense? I mean, you know that there are studies that suggest girls perform better in single-sex schools, whereas boys do better when they learn in mixed environments. Is it a zero-sum game in that sense?
Well, not if we could get more men into our classrooms. That would really help with this problem. People go for single-sex education if they're kind of worried that the school system isn't working for one or the other. We need a school system. Everyone's going to go through the state most people through the state education system.
The vast majority.
So realistically, we're not going to divide it up into single-sex schools. We have to make it work equally for boys and girls. There was a long campaign to make it work better for girls.
Yes.
Very successfully, fully support it. But when you've got 60% of undergraduates now women, you've got to start saying, look, maybe there are some ways in which the education system is actually now disfavouring boys and men, and it's OK to recognise that fact. In fact, I would now argue it's essential to recognise that fact.
Picking up on something that Tim said about encouraging men who don't traditionally want to talk necessarily about their feelings, of course, some do. And if they said how they really felt, that they might be cancelled. Is there an issue that boys, particularly teenagers, can't express how they really feel for fear that it could cross the line?
I don't think it's for fear of crossing the line. I think it's because they don't know how to talk about their feelings. They've never been taught how to talk about their feelings. They feel that they're going to be called a name. It's like wearing a pink shirt down the pub. You know, you're going to get ribbon from the boys down the pub because you've got a pink shirt on. We have to stop all that and leave everybody be as open and free and talk about anything. I mean, one of the big things for me is men talking about menopause. We get in there with that. If it works for that subject, it should work right across society.
Are there changes in the education system that would benefit boys in the way that Richard is saying, without rowing back on all of the progress that's been made with girls?
Well, I think we've made some great progress in the education system in the push on apprenticeships and technical education. I think we have had a good record on that as a government. But I think if I can just add one more thing, I think that what is good about focusing on helping men and boys achieve their potential is actually we know that most of the crime that committed in this country is committed by men and boys. So actually, if we can help men and boys live a productive life through the education system or whatever else we offer them, then we are going to definitely help women and girls, especially in the field of domestic abuse, domestic violence, and all the things, child sex abuse, all the crimes that are perpetrated by men, broadly because a lot of them have sadly grown up in homes where they haven't had strong role models. So that, I think that goes back to your point, Tim. So that is, of course, that's a great solution to this.
I agree, but I do think that the role of fatherhood here is critical, and I agree that male role models are very important, but I also think we have to recognise that the world has changed. 40% of breadwinners now are female. That's a huge achievement. And so in this world of much greater economic equality between men and women, we have to be careful that we don't essentially say to the dads who aren't breadwinners, maybe who aren't living with the mum anymore, oh, we don't need you anymore. You're redundant, not only perhaps economically, but cultural. This cultural redundancy that many fathers suffer from.
And men have a terror of that, by the way.
Absolutely.
Which is one thing that
incredibly
but one thing that isn't discussed. I'm not saying that we should adjust everything we do in order to make men feel better about themselves. But it is a reality that men need to feel needed.
Absolutely. And everybody does.
And our culture doesn't do that.
Do you think then the success of women in the workplace, the growing success of women in the workplace, has had a significant impact then on the way men feel in terms of being needed?
Well, can I just say, I think just from a relative point of view, if we're going to build the idea, if we're going to restore the sense of cultural usefulness to men, which I believe we should, it can't be on the old model of the sole or primary breadwinner. It has to be on this new model of shared breadwinning and shared parenting. And right now I feel like we're stuck between this old model and the new model we have to get to. And that's the gap that too many of our men are falling into.
And the old model doesn't reflect economic reality.
It doesn't.
The reason why there are women in the workforce from the 70s onwards is partly because the laws changed and pay changed, but because they had to, because of inflation. They were trying to keep up with the cost of living.
Sure.
So we're never going to go back to that.
And we don't want to go back to it, do we?
No, we don't. But because I, as a man, don't want to do everything. I think it's terrifying, the psychological burden of thinking you have to be strong all the time. You have to do everything. Yeah. But I would just like to see on TV in particular, one positive authoritative role model of a happy man who isn't sleeping with someone outside his marriage or isn't stealing something or isn't a slob or anything like that. The way TV presents men is, if you presented a racial minority the way much of television represents men, it would rightly be accused of bigotry and prejudice.
We're going to talk about the end of COP27, the climate conference in Egypt, and listen to the UK's representative there, Alok Sharma.
Emissions peaking before 2025, as the science tells us, is necessary. Not in this text. Clear follow-through on the phase-down of coal, not in this text. A clear commitment to phase out all fossil fuels, not in this text. And the energy text weakened in the final minutes. Friends, I said in Glasgow that the pulse of 1.5 degrees was weak. Unfortunately, it remains on life support.
Do you agree with him, Rachel?
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, Alok has got a tremendous record on this, and he has got a huge record of success on the last COP conference, and of course I agree with him. I mean, he's put more effort than anyone else into making this work. And you can hear his disappointment.
Yeah, you can absolutely hear it. I mean, do you think the will has disappeared to genuinely try and reach a limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, Carolyn?
No. And I think Alok Sharma is perfectly right. I think his role was devalued by this new Prime Minister. They didn't want him in the Cabinet. And the fact that our Prime Minister had to be forced to go to COP shows that we've not the commitment to actually deliver on it either.
Rachel?
No, I
mean, there was a lot of toing and froing, wasn't there, until Rishi Sunak
I don't exactly. If you actually look at what we've done in terms of the amount of policy, legislation, public money, taxpayers' money, commitments, etc., our record is second to none. And in fact, we're one of the leading countries in terms of driving through our commitment to reducing emissions across the globe. And I don't think no one should criticise us on that.
All right, well, let me just show you. This is a quote from the communiqué, COP27. It says to transition towards low-emission energy systems. You'll have heard Alok Sharma referencing it then. It's being seen as a sort of tacit blessing to natural gas. Again, what do you make of that, Richard?
Yeah, well, it seems like it was hard just to hold the line from the previous COP, actually. And now we've got the loss and damages fund as well. And these sorts of words that I think are, if you spend your time examining the words from these sort of communiques, you see that it's between the lines. And I think you're right. I wonder if we'll look back on this as potentially quite an important and quite a negative turning point, where the shift seems to have been from prevention to mitigation. So everyone's celebrating the loss and damages fund, and that's obviously a good thing to help countries that are being affected. But I just wonder, looking back, you think, actually, with no progress on the emissions front, and suddenly we're going to start paying money to those who are affected by it, it feels to me as if that's quite an important psychological shift.
So the will has gone, to be honest, to try and bring down levels to 1.5 Celsius.
It's certainly weakened, in part because of another shift, which is Ukraine. In domestic politics, people are probably slightly less interested in global warming right now than they are about the prices of their bills. And of course, people would say there's a link between the two. If you insulate on a massive scale, you might be able to help one with the other. But a lot of people have always been sceptical about COP. The very idea of leaders from across the world flying in gas-guzzling jets to go somewhere, something they should be able to do by Zoom by now, given that the rest of us were able to conduct our business on Zoom during COVID. I don't understand why world leaders can't do it. If they were to waste all that time and all that money, but produce something, voters might say, fair enough. But to do all of that and then come out of it with such an ambiguous result leaves one thinking, is this becoming a bit of a joke?
Well, and the issue of loss and damage payments, which has been included, is that something you celebrate, compensation for those countries that are already suffering from the impacts of climate change?
So my understanding is that we haven't seen the detail of what that actually means, and I think I would come at that from what is actually going to be spent, who's going to hold them to account, and do we actually know it's going to do the job it's supposed to do, and also how much are we going to have to contribute?
Right, well, certainly you're
coming from?
Well, and they haven't said any of those things as yet. It's just in principle. Do you agree with it in principle?
I do, and I just come back from a conference in Reykjavik, and we're talking to people whose country is affected, and they are talking in desperate terms about their standard of living, how their homes are affected. So I do agree with it in principle, yeah.
Right, because the Conservative MP said that actually constituents in his area saying absolutely not at a time of cost of living crisis.
Some are saying that, some are not. I mean, there's always been an assumption on the Tory right that there's an instinctive suspicion about net zero. Actually, my experience with most voters is they think you can do both at the same time. Right. And insulation is the key to doing that, and I still don't understand why the government's not pouring money and time into it.
Thank you to all of my guests today for joining me. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15. From all of us here, bye-bye.